relating to Iran and India. Dr. Richard Williams of the School of Oriental and African Studies is going to be presiding over today's proceedings, and so I now hand over to him.
Great, thank you, Francis, and welcome everyone. It's so nice to see so many people have been able to tune in today. So it's a great honour to be moderating this event. As you can see at the moment, we have 76 participants, which is a very strong number. And I'm sure a lot of us have come to support Roy and to congratulate him. I'm really pleased that we've been able to do this event because, of course, if there had a pandemic, we'd all be gathering somewhere in central London to sort of celebrate this. So thank you everyone for coming in to be with Roy to mark this really special event. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers because some of you may not have met the author, in fact. So first of all, we're going to hear from the author himself, Roy Fischel, who is currently lecturer in the history of South Asia and my colleague at SOAS. And before he joined SOAS, Roy was doing his PhD in Chicago, History of Asian Languages and Cultures, which is where he planted the seeds for what has now grown and bloomed in this book. And as you'll hear, he's a scholar of early modern South Asia within the context of the Muslim world and the Indian Ocean. I won't say much to him because we're about to hear all about his work for the rest of the session. After Roy has spoken a little and talked us through his work, we're going to hear from two guest speakers. First of all, we're going to hear from Professor Richard Eaton, who's calling in from the University of Arizona. So again, it's wonderful, got so many people from outside of the UK who are able to be with. And many people here will know Richard Eaton's work, but he's a scholar of the social and cultural history of the Deccan. Most recently, of course, he's published India in the Persianate Age, 1765. And so it's absolutely wonderful that Professor Eaton's been able to join us and to share his thoughts on Roy's book. And then following Richard Eaton, we're going to hear from Professor Polly O'Hanlon from the University of Oxford, who many of us will know. She's a social and intellectual historian of India and has a broad range of interests across early modern and colonial India. And she has a particular interest in the history of Maharashtra. And again, when I was going through this book, you could see that there were lots of different areas which I'm sure Polly would have opinions on. So it's fantastic that she can be with us today to share her insights. And so Roy will have time to respond to both speakers who are coming from quite different perspectives in their engagement in his work. And then after that, we're going to open up the floor to a Q&A. Because we are doing it online and because we now have 84 participants, we're going to keep simple and streamlined Zoom chat function with the little speak. So at any stage, whenever anyone's speaking or during the Q&A, you can type a question or a comment into the chat. And during the Q&A, I'll be moderating, so I will read out questions or comments from the floor, either to Roy or to our two respondents as well. And so that should give us plenty of time to have a very rich discussion of this work. So without further ado, over to Roy.
Thank you, Richard. I'm really excited to be here and to have this opportunity to present my work. And in particular that with those weird circumstances, I actually can see, even if from distance, so many people from anywhere between California and the easternmost I've noticed here is Hong Kong. Hi, Amrita. So this is a really great event for me. first, before I would like to present a little bit of the book, and I'm trying to, I prepared a few points because otherwise I will go on forever. But before that, I would like first to thank everyone who was involved here. First of all, the Royal Asiatic Society, Alison for great support, and especially to the publication committee, to Francis, Evrim for pushing me actually in that direction, and I'm glad that you were able to make it this evening, and Peter, if he's around, and of course from the Edinburgh University Press side, to particularly to Nicola Ramsey and the whole team there, who were just magnificent to work with. And to those who agreed to take part in this discussion. So Richard, save me 2 names, and Polly, thank you so much for reading, and I'm very much looking forward to hear your input and your questions. I wanted to start by how I reached to this region, or my first impression of it. And that's something that happened about 12 years ago, second year of my PhD program, when I took the graduate seminar on the Mughal Empire with Professor Muzaffar Alam, who later was my supervisor. And I remember that we talked about, one of the weeks was about the Mughal adventures or misadventures in the Deccan. And I don't remember what I asked him in particular, but I just remember that I couldn't understand what was going on. And this kind of embarrassment pushed me to work a little bit more, in particular when I asked him to engage with me in explaining. He said, okay, you have a wonderful topic for, it was the second year qualifying paper, and then PhD, and then a book, mostly because I just found it very difficult to understand how things sit together in the Deccan. So the first thing that I've realized was how utterly confusing this region is. The many histories of the region, and histories, I mean that the historical developments, as well as the historiographical work on the Deccan, seem to follow very different directions that seem to move in parallel lines. Sometimes they collide, but more often they just move in completely different space. So it's actually kind of difficult, and I dedicated basically a chapter to try to understand what the Deccan is. We use it so often, it still is used, and people assume that you know what the Deccan is. But it's not really fully defined. While often it is referred to as yet another one of those regions of India. So if we look at histories of the conquest of the Mughals, we'll say, oh, first Gujarat and Bengal, and then the Deccan. But the Deccan is not like any of these other regions of India in that sense. Much of the problem, in my understanding, is that unlike other parts of the subcontinent, it's very difficult to bring all those trajectories, all those stories to let's say, to collapse them into one coherent story. If we think of Gujarat, the neighbor of the Deccan, even though this region is, of course, greatly diverse, as we know from works of scholars such as Farhat Hassan or Samira Sheikh, we can still build some sort of linear story in which we see the region gradually coming to itself to create something of coherent understanding of what Gujarat is. Even if the boundaries are debated, there is clear what is the core, what is the peripheries, and how they communicate with it. Even more so, identities like Bengal is something that we have for centuries. On the other side of things, we have the Mughal Empire with unparalleled extent and diversity that still can be understood within this kind of framework of core and periphery. There is very clear what is the center of it, how the peripheries work within this kind of imperial system in systems of hierarchies. So we have wonderful works that show regional identities within the Mughal Empire, but they're organized as blocks under this kind of center which sits somewhere between Delhi and Agra. For the Deccan, we cannot use any of those two models to understand this region. So it was diverse to levels that we don't see in places like Gujarat. First of all, if we think about what is the language of the Deccan, if we think about, even if we take into consideration the multilingualism, which is so much built into Indian cultural system and cultural structures, we still see in the Deccan that we can create not only a multilingual nodes, but actually we can map several of those languages into different spaces. So the space of the Deccan itself is not where one language is spoken. It is defined by the collection of three languages which do not overlap. Actually, it's much more complicated, in particular the Western Deccan, with the spaces of Marathi and Kannada. The imperial model, on the other side, which became the gold standard of state in the early modern Muslim world and the European endeavors, fails to describe the Deccani system by itself. So if the regional model seems to be a bit problematic here, the imperial model does not seem to reply. Because instead of this consolidation and collapsing everything into some sort of hierarchical center and system, we find continuous and even stubborn multiplicity that cannot be included in one hierarchical order, making them unsuitable for any kind of clear imperial narrative. As a result, when talking about the Deccan under the rule of the early modern sultanates, we encounter parallel conversations. Some include the high-level political arrangements around the sultanates in particular, which follow very familiar Persianate and Islamicate form, the kind that we know from other parts of the Muslim East, from Central Asia and Iran to the Ottoman world. Other narratives focus on the Deccani context, Muslim and Hindu alike. Maratha history seems to work within itself without communicating with the other stories around the same time and around the same place. And of course, we have the vast world and the rich world of historiography talking about Vijayanagara and the successor Nayaka state that seems to also follow another trajectory. Those worlds began to be considered together only in the recent few decades. In particular, we see the beginning with the work of art historians, and they were some, or they still are some wonderful art historians who work on this region, and later also works of historians, and of course, I'm sure that we are all familiar with the work of Richard Eaton alone and in collaboration of Richard Wagoner, trying to start introducing these kind of local words together. What I try to do in this book is some sort of modest attempt to establish somewhat of a general framework that will allow us to bring all those stories together within this historical moment and the debate around it. Now, I construct the discussion around some of the most visible divisions in the region. First of all, the political one that is omnipresent in the book between 5 sultanates, 3 of which are actually worth working on because we have sources. The other 2 we know only from external sources. And the other major division is the social one that is quite often, and I constructed it around 3 clusters. The first one, of course, is the Deccanis, or the Muslim elites who saw themselves as the sons of the place. They are very much associated with Deccani language, but of course, no one was monolingual in that period and that time. Another cluster is those who called themselves foreigners or members of trans-regional networks, mostly Iranian, who for most part rejected the locality and continued living in their transient world, moving between places, between courts in the Deccan, outside the Deccan. The third, which is, I find most problematic to call that a cluster, because of its greatest diversity, is all those non-Muslim elites. Very problematic to bring them together, but it is for the purpose of the analysis I had to do that. That being said, I dedicate 2 and not 1 chapter to these groups and the very complex relationships they had with the Sultanates. Among them, I've mentioned before the Marathas, who are, of course, very known throughout South Asian history, but we also have the Telugu-speaking historical landed elites. We have the Marathi-speaking Brahmins with their networks in Maharashtra, outside Maharashtra in the Deccan and into North India, which Polly O'Hanlon, of course, worked intensively on. All of them had their own memories. It's not as if that we are talking about individuals who are being recruited into some sort of system and floating it within the rules set by the rulers. On the contrary, actually they brought significant identities and also the power to impose their ideas, or at least to make the sultans take care of these or take into considerations these sensitivities in order for them to agree to take part in this political endeavor. So this diversity within the elites is also reflected in the linguistic divisions between the Persian of the foreigners, and the foreigners, we have no evidence that in terms of writing, textual evidence, they wrote in any language other than Persian. Even more interesting, for the Deccan, unlike North India, unlike the Mughal environment, we don't see other groups other than the foreigners writing in Persian. We do have this kind of in-between combination, so highly Persianized Marathi written in Modi script, to quote the work of Sumit Guha, but by themselves, we don't see Abul Fazl, for example. We don't see local Muslims who engage fully in this Persian world the way that we see in the north. We have those local elites who write in Dakhani and foster in Dakhani and engage very much with Sufi activity, but of course Sufism was so broad and important that we have also the foreigners engaging in writing and in combination with the Sufi world. And we have the local population, not only Hindu, but also Muslim, engaging in writings in Telugu and in Marathi and in Kannada. While linguistic boundaries were not fixed or very solid all the times, a sense of identity has often been attached to language. With this social diversity and furthermore the significance of language in the formation of identity, the courts were involved with varying circles of language production, use and patronage without any dominance to any language. So if we compare it, and as much as it pains me, the spirit of the Mughals is always around. If we compare it to the Mughal court, to quote the work of Muzaffar Alam, we don't have Persian. We don't have the equivalent of Persian as a language of empire, which is dominant and that all the vernacular production has to respond to. We have it in the Mughal case, or the fashioning of Persian as a language of empire. We don't have state language in that sense in the South. So this multiplicity brought to parallel and at times competing notions of territoriality, as each group had different concept of what is their domain, where they are very freely moving around. The Deccanis and foreigners shared identities that crossed political boundaries in the Deccan, but for most part did not cross to the south or the east, so for in the direction of the Hindu-ruled courts. The Iranians or the foreigners were very happy, though, to move to the Mughal court or back to Iran, to the Safavids, circulating around the Indian Ocean. For some local groups, the scope was much more limited, but even this scope was, they were very happy to cross to other courts, to Vijayanagara, for example, or just to ignore the sultanates altogether if they could. So each group's perceived domain that carried its own meaning, marking its own set of insiders and outsiders. The result was a complex system in which social identities and territorial sensitivities of any group, or none of those groups actually, were aligned fully with the political configurations. Each political unit had a little bit of all, and each group within each, let's say, sultanate had a place to go to, another place to go to if they didn't want to stay under those rulers. They had other options. It sounds like it would be a major problem for the sultanates, but we have to keep in mind that the three main sultanates survived very well within this mess. So Ahmadnagar, in one way or the other, survived for 150 years. The southernmost neighbors, Bijapur and Golconda, functioned for full 2 centuries. Now that to compare to the duration of Mughal rule in the Deccan, or at least in the central Deccan, which was no more than 40 years. So they did something right, which seems like it would act or behave very differently of whatever the Mughals did in the north. So their success was at least in part due to their ability to speak in this kind of parallel languages. And by that, to convince those diverse elites to cooperate and just not to move somewhere else. All sultanates engaged with Islamic 8 idioms and the Persianate language of the Muslim East. In Bijapur and Golconda, at least, we don't really know what was the situation in Ahmadnagar in that sense. We know that rulers were personally involved in writing in Dakhani, both as patrons, but also as writers themselves, with the most known cases are Muhammad Quli Qutb Shah in Golconda, and he is both very important writers themselves of Dakhani. In other respects, they adopted different models according to local circumstances. In Golconda and Ahmadnagar, the sultans became champions of vernacular identities, successfully positioning themselves within the long histories of both Telugu and Marathi-speaking elites, respectively. Bijapur, which due to its configuration could not create similar association, fell back to another kind of framework, and that's some sort of Deccani imperial past and imperial memory that linked it first to the Western Chalukyas, and definitely under the rule of Ibrahim Adil Shah II from 1580, back to Vijayanagara. Vijayanagara became or featured increasingly importantly in the political language of this court. Each strategy has its pros and cons that I don't have time to cover now, but it was sufficient to create durable political system. But at the same time, it also posed some serious restrictions. They could not expand much more beyond their original boundaries without risking this agreement, this contract with all those elites. So this brings us back to the question of the early modern world. For most part, this discourse emphasizes empire as the predominant form of state in this period, most historical discourses of the time. The Deccan Sultanates developed in a distinctly different way. They remained limited in their geographical extent and lacked the mechanism to force all components of their society into this hierarchical idea or concept of empire. They did not have the ability to impose their ideas of sovereignty and its spatial manifestation, as the elites remained espoused to their own ideas and networks that crossed political boundaries. As a result, instead of hierarchical incorporation, the system as a whole relied on constant negotiation with elites who always had other options. They could always decide that they serve other masters. The political language of the Sultanates reflects this, not claiming for their own source of authority the way that we know from the Safavid, the Ottoman, or the Mughal case. They kind of found an in-between way, saying that they acknowledge their inferiority, and we see it mostly in Persian, the language of this imperial world. They express quite explicitly that they know that they are inferior, but they have a role in the world and a position, independent position that they could claim in order to remain legitimate rulers in this imperial world as non-imperial actors. This interpretation marks the Sultanates as neither failed empires nor provinces waiting to be conquered, as they are often described. But they're actually a different kind or type of state altogether, with its unique ideas of state and sovereignty. Instead of remote trans-regional empire, the structure and political language reflects a dispersed notion of sovereignty, marked by plurality and flexibility. They were at the same time linked to the cosmopolitan Persianate world and spoke the language of the local. Accepting their weak position, they embraced unprecedented pluralism, expressed in royal engagement with Persian, Deccani, and the vernaculars, in particular Marathi, Telugu, and we also assume still needs to be proven, Kannada, and at the same time also Sanskrit and Arabic. This engagement suggests the rejection of universal claims in favor of carefully tailored idiom. So with this conclusion, I just want to mention places where I hope that this book can communicate or have some kind of impact. So I really hope that this framework that I presented here will allow us to better integrate the separate conversations within the history of South India, to show that the Maratha, or to understand the Marathas not only as a unique phenomenon by themselves, but also as a group that worked within the system of the Deccan Sultanates. To acknowledge the role of Vijayanagara not only as a target of some kind of heated debates and lots of rhetoric, but also as an actual source for state formation within the Deccan Sultanates, the way that I hope I was able to demonstrate in the case of Bijapur under Ibrahim. At the same time, I think that, I hope that this book offers a modest contribution to the idea that even within this imperial world, maybe we shouldn't engage wholly and solely with the idea of empire as the only state. We have other forms that are worth to be considered. And if we do that, we can acknowledge the fact that there are trajectories that the mechanism of empire may obliterate, that we just cannot see them, but they are there even in imperial history. And in that sense, I hope that the book will offer some contribution to our understanding even of the Mughal Empire at the time. I think that I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you, Roy. Thank you. There is lots of exciting points and arguments here, which I'm sure people will want to respond to. So a reminder to everyone, there will be a Q&A at the end. So save your questions or put them into the group chat. But before we do that, let's proceed with our first respondent, Professor Richard Eaton.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Good, good. You never know what's going for sure with this technology. Well, first of all, let me express my gratitude for being invited to join this occasion. It really is a pleasure and a great honor. I have to say, talking about the Deccan always takes me back to my first days of doing my own PhD work taking the first locomotive train from Hyderabad out to Bijapur, and discovering all kinds of amazing things. And I've never really left that world. So it is a great pleasure to kind of return, in a sense, to thinking about the Deccan and thinking in very new and fruitful ways. I wish at the very outset to congratulate Roy on making what I consider a major contribution to our understanding of this region, which is, as Roy has eloquently shown, is so difficult to kind of get our minds wrapped around, and just in terms of, what is it, where is it, what does it mean, this word Deccan. But as I see it, Roy's book makes a number of contributions. At one level, it's a fascinating comparative study of the principal sultanates of the Northern Plateau. And I don't think anybody's actually done that. As Roy correctly points out, there are a number of very important studies of individual sultanates. But my own is one example, Bijapur. There have been many attempts to kind of talk about the whole Deccan Plateau as a unit, but nobody really has analytically sat down and tried to understand how we can compare and contrast the principal sultanates of the north. And I think that's one of the major things that Roy is doing here that I find interesting. Secondly, his discussion of sovereignty. What he's really presenting here is a meditation on different theories of sovereignty that were articulated at various times in different parts of the plateau, which again, I think is what makes the study so fascinating, because as he clearly shows, there never was a single empire, at least after the Western Chalukyas, that straddled the entire region. So we had these competing notions of sovereignty that Roy works with, that I find fascinating. And then thirdly, his discussion of the dominant ruling classes, which include, of course, not only the Deccanese and the foreigners, but the various non-Muslim communities as well that were interacting with them. So his effort to kind of show how these all work together, where the points of conflict came, when they came, and why they came, is yet another important contribution. In terms of big takeaway for me, what I find really exciting is how Roy has managed to integrate a discussion of linguistic geography with political geography, and how those two ways of thinking about space interacted. This I find to be one of the most original and most fruitful dimensions of the study. His whole idea that you have two of these three dominant sultanates, which is to say Ahmednagar and Golconda, were relatively well nested within their respective vernacular regions, right? So we have Golconda planted right in the heart of Telangana, in the heart of the Telugu-speaking region, identified very closely with earlier Telugu dynasties, in particular the Kakatiya of the Eastern Deccan. Over on the western side, we have, oh, and by the way, we have very important Telugu warrior classes, the Nayakas, who are a point of continuity between the Kakatiyas and the Qutub Shahis of Golconda. So we have both Telugu warrior classes and Telugu Brahmins who are participating in this very Telugu state. And Roy makes a similar case for the western side of the Deccan, where Marathi language and Maratha warriors are participating in a way that is analogous to what's going on over in Golconda. In other words, that Ahmednagar is similarly nested within a coherent core linguistic region. So this kind of playing with linguistic geography and political geography as a means of explaining the stability and the duration of these sultanates and their success, I consider to be a fascinating hypothesis here. In contrast to all that, and in a sense, giving weight and substance to Roy's argument about the Golconda and Ahmednagar cases, we have Bijapur, whose capital is clearly not situated in any single, the heart of any one of the three languages of the Deccan. It really occupies what geographers would call a shadow zone. It's out there kind of somewhere between the hearts of the Telugu, the Marathi, and the Kannada-speaking regions. And so Roy argues that more or less by default, what the sultans of Bijapur had to do was to rely on a more imperial conception of sovereignty, for which they leaned on not only the more recently defeated kings of Vijayanagara, but also the more distant ones of the Kalyana Chalukya dynasty. Using similar rituals, political rituals, architecture, even the political language of these earlier empires to reinforce their own claims to rule. But this strategy failed. Bijapur obviously was defeated by the Mughals, but more importantly, their attempt to move south into the extreme south, even the Tamil south, took them way out of their comfort zone, and they were simply unable to with any credibility, attempt to annex the Tamil-speaking deep south, or even the Kannada southwest part of the plateau. So Roy's attempt to think about linguistic geography and its interrelation with political geography, I found to be a very fruitful way of thinking about the different fates of these three dominant sultanates. The second major takeaway to me was his discussion of the two dominant Muslim political classes, the foreigners and the Deccanese, and how these classes interrelated. Now, a great deal has already been written about these two classes. In that sense, but we're not learning all that much new here. But what I find is new is Roy's discussion of the much greater degree of mobility among the foreigners in contrast to the Deccanese. Of course, we already knew that. We knew there was a circulation of these foreigners between Iran, between the Mughals, and the Deccan itself. But Roy uses that greater mobility as a hinge, as a way, again, of arriving at fundamental explanations. So with these insights, I'd like to move in the few minutes I have remaining to several questions I want to put to Roy that came to my mind, at least. The first one has to do with these two binary categories, the Deccani and the foreigner. And I really wonder how fixed in practice they really were. I mean, rhetorically, contemporaries use the words as if they were cast iron, separate social categories, and subsequent historians, right down to the present, have done the same thing. But I wonder how fixed they really were and how much slippage there might have been between them. I think of, for example, the Sultan of Bijapur, Ismail Adil Shah, who on one occasion banished both the Habshis, that is to say the African Ethiopian slaves, and the Deccanese from the Sultanate, retaining only the foreigners. But then the foreigners' children, who had been born in the Deccan, were similarly not allowed to, they were treated like Deccanese by the Sultan. The earlier generation lobbied the Sultan to have their own children not considered Deccanese, but considered foreigners, for which purpose they could then serve in the military forces. The Sultan consented to that. He allowed them to be considered foreigners. 5 or 6 months later, the same Sultan went further and ruled that both Afghans and Rajputs could also serve the state, so long as they had not participated in any rebellion against the state. So in other words, in effect, it's not only the children of these foreigners, but it was also the Afghans and Rajputs who were being treated as de facto foreigners. They were suggesting, in other words, that it was political behavior, which was ultimately the more important thing, and not necessarily one's ethnicity, religion, or even place of birth. So all this raises the question of, how long does one remain a foreigner? How many generations does it take before one no longer can make that claim with any credibility? And how does one become a Deccan? On page 106 of Roy's book, he tells us that some of those who settled permanently gradually became identified as Deccanese, while others preferred to emphasize their foreign origin. Well, I wonder if we can get away with that easily. It raises, to me anyway, the question of, does one's self-identification really work? Clearly, what others think of you needs to be added into this mix, it would seem to me. So I just wanted to kind of raise this whole question of how solid, how fixed these categories actually were, and how a foreigner could become a Deccan, whether they wanted to or not. And to what degree does one's own claim count as opposed to the views of outsiders. A second question I wanted to raise was, and this goes back to the question of the foreigners. Roy very persuasively points out that these foreigners would come in and they're, again, going back to their mobility, their high degree of mobility. They were moving around all the time. If they didn't like one particular patron, they could just as easily shove off and move to the next patron, next door. In other words, their loyalty to the Sultan was always questionable. Everyone knew that. And so my question to Roy is, if they were so mobile, if they had so many options to move not only within the Deccan, but for that matter, go off to the Mughals or go back home to Iran, why then were they so eagerly sought in the first place, if their loyalty was so questionable? Is it only a matter of their specialized expertise or the cachet that would come with their graces of Persian culture? Obviously, these people had a certain degree of prestige and cachet because of their knowledge of Persian. It goes back to this whole status, the question of the status of Persian culture in the Deccan. Or how do we explain that? And as I thought about this question, Roy, it occurred to me that although you don't specifically do this, we could almost contrast the status of the foreigners with that of the Habshis, in the sense that the Habshis seem to have brought a great deal of loyalty to the table, although they had zero status in terms of Persian cachet. So it's almost as if the sultans were experimenting with a kind of a trade-off, that with the foreigners, they had all the graces of Persian culture, as well as expertise, obviously, in administration and so forth. But the cost was their limited loyalty. Whereas with the Habshis, you have just the reverse. It appears to me that they were staunchly loyal, relatively speaking, to whatever sultan they were attached to, but they had very little, if any, status or cultural cachet, as it were. And so I want to bring this to a close by simply asking one third question, and this goes to, well, actually, a minor point here. This question of use the word foreigners versus Westerners, which which Roy and I have discussed before. And to get to the bottom of this, I think I have a clear understanding of what's going on here. The earliest lithograph edition of Ferishta's Tariqa Ferishta, the Bombay version, the orthography, the way in which the word is written, could be either seen as gharib or gharbi, which is to say it could be either foreigner or Westerner, because of the way the dots work. But the first lithography version where the writing is clear, which is to say that of the Nebel Kishore version up in Lucknow, done in around 1864, 65, I think. It's very clear that the word Gharbi or Westerner is used by Ferishta, but not consistently. Sometimes he'll say Gharbi, sometimes he'll say Gharib, or foreigner. And to make matters still more confusing, I've been looking at more recent editions of Ferishta in Iran. In Tehran, there's a new printed version where the term gharib or foreigner is used consistently throughout. So I guess I'm simply, well, it's not so much a question perhaps, but as a comment, it occurs to me, it seems to me that different copyists were using perhaps different manuscripts in these early lithograph editions in the 19th century, which may explain all this. But in the last analysis, it really doesn't matter, because we all know that whether you call them foreign or Western, these are the people who came from the other side of the Arabian Sea. So they were both foreign and Western. In closing, I'd like to simply return to the word Deccan. And I guess I have to say I'm not persuaded that we can use the word Deccan referring only to that area north of the Krishna, which Roy occasionally seems to be trying to tell us. We all know the Deccan simply means the south, Dakshina. But in the last analysis, it seems to me that what really defines this, what has caused all this is the river Krishna, which clearly divides, at least geographically, the northern and southern Deccan. But in terms of topography, there's nothing that changes as you move from the north to the south. In terms of language, people are still speaking Kannada or Telugu on both sides of the river. And indeed, the Chalukya Empire did straddle both sides of the river and controlled virtually the entire plateau. So it occurs to me that what really we're talking about is what happened in the mid-14th century with the collapse of the Tughlaq rule in the Deccan Plateau and the creation of these two new sultanates, the Bathani in the north and Vijayanagara in the south. And that ever since then, there has been in historiography this notion of a Muslim north and a Hindu south, which to my mind has distorted the historiography, I think, in a very negative way. So I would simply close by suggesting here that I wish there had been a more discussion of the whole Deccan, or maybe if Roy had simply stated more clearly that he's only going to look at the northern Deccan and make it clear that we're going to leave the south out for particular purposes, I would have been happier. But other than that, I just want to close by congratulating Roy once again on making what I consider to be a very important contribution to our understanding of this most confusing region. So thanks again, Roy.
Thank you, Dick. Richard, how shall I reply now, or is it better if Polly spoke now?
I think it probably makes sense to go straight to Polly, just in case she also has comments or questions that will speak to how you want to reply to to this last set of questions. So Polly, shall we turn to you now?
Thank you, Richard. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you folks, particularly Roy and others, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful occasion. And may I echo Richard in congratulating Roy on this absolutely wonderful book. There is so much to learn from it, so much to admire in it, so much just to enjoy in it, and it's already acquiring a very thumbed appearance on my bookshelves. I'll look at some slightly different ground from what Richard Eaton has looked at. Just mention a couple of the points about the book, the sort of major arguments of the book that I particularly appreciated, and some smaller points. Clearly, Roy, what you've done is move away from Mughal-centric understandings of India's early modern centuries. You've offered us a really nuanced mapping of the sort of plural and overlapping frameworks for the expression of universal sovereignty that we associate with the Mughal Empire. You see those as plural rather than a kind of monolithic framework. And of course, you make the case for the Deccan states as offering a distinctive non-imperial understanding of sovereign power. And that seems to me, a really major intervention, a wonderful new perspective from which to look at the Mughals. You also, and I have long been one of the puzzled people that you mention, as I try to understand the sort of endless fractures and overlaps and complexities of the Deccan Sultanate states. They're different geographical locations, different constitution of state elites, different relations with local gentry groups, local vernaculars. There are different strategic options in the face of Mughal challenges. Again, I really appreciated the nuance here in the way that you show how the space of the Deccan was imagined differently by these different political communities. And I also appreciated very much what you say about the more dispersed notion of sovereignty coming out of the Deccan states, based on careful negotiation with diverse groups at local level, rather than some kind of monolithic, hierarchical, non-local expression of sovereignty that we associate with the Mughal Empire. What you say there about forms of sovereignty based on negotiation reminds me very much of the super work that Dominic Vendel is now doing on negotiation negotiation and forms of political ethics that were associated with the 18th century Maratha state. I don't think Dominic is with us today, unfortunately, but if you don't know his work, and I'm sure you do, you two have an awful lot to say to each other. I particularly enjoyed, just in a matter of sort of sitting back and enjoying the reading, your insightful analysis of the exchanges between Shah Jahan, Muhammad Adil Shah, and Abdullah Qutb Shah of Golconda, where, of course, as you describe in your conclusion, the Deccan states, Shah Jahan compares the Deccan states to mere hoopoe birds. And of course, these characters have the last laugh, because they point out that, in fact, the hoopoe bird, if you look at Quranic and other sources, have a special role to play in the divine plan. So those were all the things that I enjoyed, and in fact, those were just some of the things that I enjoyed. So let me come now to a couple of questions. You rightly remind us with this turning away from Mughal-centric accounts of the 16th and 17th century, that we should also question the way in which early modern empires are seen as the precursors to the modern bureaucratic state. You emphasize that, in fact, consciously non-imperial states like the Deccan Sultanates also helped to shape the forms of early modernity that come to the subcontinent in these centuries. But I wonder if I could tempt you to put it rather more strongly. Could we argue that it is in fact the Deccan Sultanate states who are the true harbingers of the early modern, because it is their unique exposure to the wider Indian Ocean world which helps account for their remarkable social and political heterogeneity. And it's this heterogeneity, of course, which really lies behind their generation of these alternate and much more dispersed negotiation-based understandings of sovereignty. Of course, in talking of the unique exposure to the Indian Ocean world, in a way, kind of touching on the point that Dick has just made, that what actually is the Deccan. You know, you can ask what the Deccan is by standing somewhere in the Deccan and looking north, south, east, and west, or you can ask what the Deccan is by standing on the opposing coasts of the peninsula and saying that the Deccan is in part defined by its long coastlines, by its particular openness to the trading world of the Persian Gulf, the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean. Of course, it's this exposure which brings Shiite state builders from Iran, which brings military slaves from Ethiopia, links to the valuable trades of the Persian Gulf, which pass through the ports of the Konkan coast on the west, coastal Golconda's links with the valuable trade of the Coromandel coast. And of course, it's this coastal exposure which early attracted the European trading companies, cloth and saltpeter in particular. And their presence, of course, is a further element in the social and political heterogeneity of the Deccan states. So my first question is whether we can tempt Roy to speculate on this theme of political heterogeneity and this unique maritime exposure, to claim something even stronger for his argument, that it's the Deccan Sultanate states that are the real harbingers of the early modern, because it is they that, with their social and political heterogeneity, really reflect the penetration of the maritime world. So that's my first question. I just have one other question, which is a more particular one, and again, if I could tempt Roy to speculate on what I know is quite a difficult subject. Turning to questions about Maratha history in particular, you take us through the firm attachment that Shahaji Bhosle and his son Shivaji show for the forms and the symbolism of the Nizam Shahi state, and those points are very well taken. Others have made them. I think Stuart Gordon emphasised something about that, and of course you have also put it very well. So the question really is, what is it about the milieu of the Deccan by the later 17th century that leads Shivaji in his consecration of 1674? What is it about changes in the milieu which leads Shivaji apparently to turn his back on those older forms of the Nizam Shahi state towards what looks like, at least, a very different set of symbols and associations with the invocation of dharmic kingship that we see in that consecration ceremony? A handbook of ritual that has to be specially written for the occasion, because this sort of abhisheka apparently hasn't been done for so many centuries. Of course, many people speculate on the shaping of the consecration ceremony, and many political agendas have long played into interpretations of that ceremony. But particularly looking at the move, what looks like the move away from affection for, identification with the forms of royalty associated with the Nizam Shahi state. What we then see Shivaji doing in the 1670s looks even more striking, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about that that you'd like to share with us. So those are my two questions. questions, and thank you very much again indeed for what was a truly wonderful read. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly, very much, and Richard, for both of you, for first of all very kind words. I'm truly humbled by it, and for those wonderful questions that are all so challenging, and I think that show very much, or let's say that we have about 5 to 7 articles that were being asked here. I will try to engage with him as much, or to speculate, as you said, Polly. I have a lot to think about now, that's for sure. Let me start with Richard's first question about the binaries, and I think that it's a wonderful question, because it's exactly about the processes. It's a broader question about issues of migration, assimilation, social markers as related to those issues that seem to be always at the focus of the historical process, and in recent decade or so in particular. Trying to think how to go around it. I of course, completely, the example that you brought about the rule of Ismail is terrific in that sense. Because there is always this kind of interplay between, let's say, the view from the group and the view from outside. I tend to agree with you that the ethnic aspect here is extremely dubious. And to follow, of course, the great work of Dirk Kolff on 16th century North India, with the idea that, or that he demonstrates very nicely how Afghan and Rajput are actually occupational categories way more than anything else. And Cynthia Talbot's work about this kind of interaction in the language and imaginations of groups, how this involved and how nuanced all this is. Yeah, those tools seem to be a very appropriate here, I would say. I think that the problem is that we cannot treat all the foreigners as one group in that sense. And I show in the book that, first of all, we have those who continue to be, first of all, we have the famous division, or a weird manifestation of the division between Turks and Tajiks, in the way that those who are considered to be in the Safavid system as Tajiks, or the people of the Pan, the Iranian speakers, are those who became the elites in the Deccans, even though they carry, of course, many military positions. And those who are identified by tribal identities, by association with some sort of Turkoman past or Turkic past, are actually disappear from record very quickly. We don't know what happens to them. We don't know them as individuals, except for very rare cases. And most of the time we talk about the networks of those Iranians. Or those Iranians, I mean, those who identify themselves as the Persianate elites from Iran, not the Turkic elites from Iran. And in that sense, I think that the question is even more complicated, because who among these would become afterwards Deccani? Deccani is a matter of, it's a process that took a long time, the creation of Deccani standard, and it did start by migrants. So even Deccanis are not that local in their origin. And there is, I think that it's an excellent question, when do they stop being foreigners in that sense? My guess, and that's, let me speculate here, those who retain the identity as belonging to a place in Iran, and I made a case in the book about the Gilanis, that anyone with the same Gilani was considered to be legitimate for Mahmud Gawan and his successions, their interests, and they remain foreigners. Others chose to settle down. That's the problem with migration, and the biggest problem of the Deccan is, of course, how little documented it is. I think that it calls for a really thorough study. It's a terrific question that, yeah, I don't think that I can bring up a much better answer right away. As to the question of their mobility, first of all, it's very important to remember that there is a major change between the Bahmani period and the Deccan Sultanates. In the Bahmani period, we see the actual importation of those foreigners. You know, the famous stories about sending, well, the stories that I know from reading your work, of course, about the inviting Hafiz, and he's coming arriving at the coast and refusing to get on the ship because the ocean looks a little bit iffy. We have those stories from the Bahmani period about the recruitment, the active recruitment of those elite. We don't have them very much from the Deccan Sultanates. When we see the stories, people decide to come and show up. All of a sudden, people just show up in Bijapur and say, give me employment, or usually use their cousins or other people from the same network to get them employment. So in that sense, I think that it's, in terms of this process, there is a very big difference between, how shall I put it, between demanding them to come or walking the extra mile to bring them, the way that actually the Ethiopians, and I completely accept your comparison here, or the fact that they are mirroring each other in a way. I think that it's a very good way to look at it. They continued to buy deliberately the Ethiopians. Most famous is, of course, Malik Ambar. But with the foreigners, it kind of like they were ready, or the sultans were ready to accept, to absorb those who floated their way or continued coming their way, but they did not establish on purpose new networks in that sense. So I think that increasingly we see them happy to use those resources and what you suggested, expertise, the cachet they bring with them with the Persianate expertise. We can add to it trade, of course, trade connection, horses, but not only. I think that it's the combination of all of these, because it's the same people who are traders and writers, or military commanders, and most terrific families, the Shirazis of Bijapur with Afzal Khan and Rafiuddin, the historian, who was, of course, on the, I think that he was in charge of the wardrobe of Ali the First. So we do have this kind of all the connections, all the advantages. But in that sense, I do think that this mobility, they offered services that were not chased after, but they did give the sultans this kind of air of legitimacy and connection to the world that the sultanates did not want to live at any point. They did not want to divorce it. And in that way, I find, and that's my instinct is that, or it took me some time to understand that, in a way, we do not raise an eyebrow when a poet moves between patrons, or a painter moves between patrons. It sounds to us something very legitimate, but it doesn't sound legitimate for us if the Mir Jumla, or the head of administration, moves service, or military commanders. That sounds like lack of loyalty. But if we think that it's the same networks that included all of these people, it kind of makes more sense. It was kind of calculated risk. And when we think about the most famous Mir Jumla, the one that the Mughals called Mir Jumla, Muhammad Said Ardestani, we see that when he decides to move to the Mughal side, there is no disaster. He went. It's not as if everything collapsed because he left. And that's the individual nature of this movement that enabled, I think, the sultans to take the risk in that sense, that it's not a huge risk on that for the advantages that they may get, which is the expertise, it's the cachet, it's the trade connections. Foreigners, yeah, I think that we will never settle this issue exactly because we have the conflicting evidence within the text. The earliest I saw version of Firishta, I went to the British Library to see their earliest manuscript, 1630s, so 20 years after it was completed. And it's, in the plural, you never know if it's Rariban or Rarbian because it's written like Pa with the 3 dots. But in the singular, it's always Rarib, never Rarbi. But again, I think that at this point, we said what we have to say about this issue, and it doesn't really matter. I completely accept that. And to your last point, it's a very fair point, and I think that I should have been more sensitive in that regard. I've been talking to other colleagues who work more to the south of the Krishna as exactly addressing this issue at one point, at looking at it as one space with the expertise of both sides. I think that a cooperation of the kind that you, Richard, have with Phil Wagoner are the only way to go forward here. That being said, I think that I still brought more Vijayanagara to the north than before. And for the sake of saying something which might be considered a little bit scandalous by some, I even think that we can push forward and look at Bijapur or to examine Bijapur within the framework of the Nayaka world to a certain degree. That we see that the same ceremonies, and in particular the Dasara, the Mahanavami Dasara complex, that is so much quoted as taking place in Nayaka courts or southern states, Hindu states, and deliberately I'm using the air quotation marks. It was very much alive in Bijapur in its own shape. So in that sense, I think that it's a very, very promising direction forward exactly to create this link. I agree that I should have emphasized more the fact that the book the perspective is still the Deccan Sultanates. And we do need to cross the Krishna more vigorously. To get to Polly's excellent points, first of all, Paul, you know that Dominic and I go a long time back from Chicago. So yeah, I should definitely...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he did his master's at Chicago.
Okay.
When I started my PhD.
Well, I'm delighted. So
yeah, so I know him for many, many years.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I definitely need to talk to him about. I'm aware of his work, and it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And that's another very promising direction to look at. I absolutely love your comment about the Deccan Sultanates as the real early modern state. I think that it's a little bit problematic here that on one side, I completely accepted your idea that, yes, they are the best connected parts of, let's say, Persianate India in that sense, for a better, for the lack of better term, with the outside world, the outside as in not only the world to the north, to the northwest, not only the Iranian or Turkic Persianate worlds, Afghan worlds, but much broader context. The problem is that we get, so in that sense, I think that the Deccan is better integrated into the discourse that we see around the Portuguese Empire, the discourse of cosmopolitanisms.
Mm.
And here I refer to the work of Zoltan Biderman and Alan Strathern and Ines Jupanov and Angela Xavier, in particular, their recent book, Angela and Ines's recent book about this kind of exchange of knowledge between the Catholic Portuguese world and that of India. But at the same time, we do have still this huge amount to climb on, and that is that the discourses of this early modern world are so imperial. As if, and here I think, of course, the work in the Portuguese context, in particular the work of Sanjay Subramaniam and George Flores, on how can we engage with those states that close themselves up in the plateau, not very much looking at what's going on the coast, even though they are, I completely agree with you, they are so heavily shaped by these international connections. They have this kind of always duality with what's going on beyond the Western Ghats. As a matter of fact, I think that this will be a much more interesting project for the later 17th century.
Yeah, maybe.
And then we have, of course, also the Dutch getting into, and the work on Dutch Masulipatam and all this. But anyways, the Deccan Sultanates were part of this world, but again, always on the margins. Were they the quintessential early modern state? In some senses, definitely. In other sense, were they? I really need to think about it. I really like. I love this idea. But
I mean, it's not just the coastal areas. Of course, you know, it's the move of Persia, of Irani elites to, you know, to the central parts of the Deccan. I mean, it's significant that Irani elites didn't seek patronage or a place in Vijayanagar or the Nayaka states. They sought a place, as you say, in the Persianate Deccan. So maybe we could say it's kind of like the Persianate Deccan, which combines both its orientation to the north, but also experiences this extraordinary opening to the maritime world. That's the distinctive.
And in that sense, maybe the best way to describe it is some sort of frontier.
Yes.
In a way, and it's a always problematic word, frontier. But yeah. Oh, and the second question is, I think that
you can think about that if you like.
Another PhD to be written about that.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
I would say some ideas that pop to mind is that the Nizam Shah and the last attempt of the Bhonsles, Shahaji in that period, it's still Shivaji was still very young at that period. The last attempt to resurrect any kind of direct Nizam Shahi association stopped in 1636.
Right.
With the exile of the last ruler. 40 years later, I don't know how much of the gravitas of any kind of Nizam Shahi memory could have happened. And in the book, I suggest that the use of the Bakars, the Marathi sources, as well as the Shiva Bharata in the memory of Ahmadnagar is because they had a role in linking the Bhonsles with the Yadavas in a way.
Yes, I see. Yeah.
Once this is done, and once the enemy is not, well, Bijapur by 1674 is dead. It's kind of on life support and money and expertise sent from Golconda, with its own very strong Brahminical connection by that time. And the enemy is Aurangzeb. So my instinct would be to check first of all, who are the new elites that the Marathas are trying to recruit in 1674, and how different the situation was comparing to the 1630s? That's one point, and the other one is how they try to build themselves as an alternative that would emphasize the difference between them and the Mughals. And it might be in a way that the more the rhetoric of Aurangzeb was pushing in one direction, as much as we know that it's rhetoric and we know how way more nuanced his policies were and how much he actually tried to incorporate the Deccani elites into the Mughal Empire, but the rhetoric was there, and maybe it's mostly a matter of counter Aurangzeb. Sure. But that's an instinct. I think that, yeah, it's going to be a great book.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So now we can open up questions to the floor. So if we were in a real physical space, I'd be walking around with a microphone. But instead, can I ask you if we have some questions to put them in the chat, and then I will read out any questions either to Roy or to Richard. So I will keep my eye on the Zoom group chat. Yes, okay, perfect. Right, so Roy, Roy, you may be able to look at them as well. So I'll read it out, everyone, but it might help you as well to read it in your head. So, okay, so on the topic of lingering Nizam Shahi norms 40 years after the collapse of the Sultanate, the gold coins which Shivaji struck at his coronation conform to the Nizam Shahi, and they also corresponded to quarter muhurs of the Mughals, a system to which Deccan was getting used to by 1674. So that's a comment from Shailen Bandre.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. The whole coinage issue of the Deccan is very, very weird. And I'm referring here to works of both Phil Wagner and Pushkar Soni. That, yeah, it's yet another one of those confusing things that we see in the Deccan Sultanates, that we are so used to, and it's almost a cliche or almost a mantra, that sovereignty in the Muslim world is measured by two points, by Sika and Khutbah. Sika of the Deccan Sultanates, as both my colleagues show, started very late, and they never really abandoned Vijayanagara standards until the Mughal standards started showing up. And yeah, no, it's a really, really interesting point. Thank you, Shailen, for this really fascinating comment. I think that we should add it to the complexity of the sovereign language of the Deccan that is not kind of working so easily with anywhere else that we know.
Some more questions or comments? I'll just keep my eye on the Zoom group chat. Perhaps while we wait for them, Roy, I have a question. So what are you working on now? What's the follow-up project after this, this book?
Yeah, thank you for that, Richard. Oh, I see that Muzaffar is joining now. Hello, Muzaffar. Not yet connected to, yeah, to this. I'll give my kudos in a bit. Yeah. Okay. Hello. How are you? My this book, if I haven't mentioned before, started as a PhD project, and my supervisor. I'm so happy to see you. That you can.
No, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I would have loved to be right from the beginning, but yes. So the discussion must be over now, no?
I'm just answering what I'm going to do next.
Oh, good. Yeah. That is good for me. Yes.
And it's wonderful to hear it from you, Richard, as you are part of the negotiations here. So I'll rope you in. One of the major projects, I think that the next big project will have to be to look more carefully at Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur. I think that he's so many narratives and discourses around him, which are so contradictory. And at the same time, he was taken so forcefully out of the history of the Deccan to create this image of the dreamer, or the Sultan who is not really a Sultan, or that I think that he has to be tied down back to the history of the region. So in the book, I already start presenting him, his connections with the ideology of Vijayanagara. I think that a very systematic study of his rule, his reign, is really in order. It's oddly enough, unlike his colleague from, or his peer from Golconda, Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah, that produced quite a lot of literature around him, I don't know proper book on Ibrahim. Dick, do you know anything? Systematic study of Ibrahim? Oh. No,
Oh, sorry, your microphone
is
off.
off.
Not yet, yes.
Okay, am I on now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, all I have to say is nothing. I don't know of any, and you're quite right. I mean, this is, Ibrahim Adil Shah I've always seen him, he's portrayed, I think, unfortunately, as he's captured the imagination as something kind of a flower child, before his time, a hippie, with his castanets and his guitar and all the rest of it. And he actually, you're right, Roy, he is more complicated. And he does behave in many kind of vicious ways that other sultans have done. I mean, I think he order the execution of his own brother at some point early in his career, which gets kind of shunted aside in our effort to kind of idolize Ibrahim. So maybe bringing Ibrahim down to earth and fitting him more tightly into his actual context as a Deccan Sultan would be in order. Yeah.
Yeah. And I see a comment by Vivek. Of course, Keelan Overton's wonderful dissertation offers a very good source to material. Right. Remains from his time. I completely agree, and I actually used Keelan's dissertation and the beautiful article she published in Mukarnas extensively. Yeah, and to that, of course, the terrific work of Deborah Hutton on the architecture, as well as, yeah. So we do have people who worked on Ibrahim, but as a systematic view, one of the things that I've noticed is that his image as kind of is completely ignoring the Persianate side of his reign. And there is the very famous quote that is circulated in so many studies from Asad Beg Kazvini, the Mughal ambassador to Bijapur, who said, oh yeah, his Persian was Shikasta, and when he got excited, he switched to Marathi, and he actually didn't know Persian. Now, we know this quote, but kind of, it's a very Mughal thing to say when he's in a mission from Akbar, who tries to show that he is the only civilized guy in town, and for him, imperial civilization is speaking Persian. And there are those sections, the hidden sections in Firishta, those that Briggs did not translate, even though they are the juiciest, in which there is a very long description of how he himself taught Ibrahim to read Persian. Not he himself, sorry, Shah Nawaz Khan taught Ibrahim, and then Ibrahim, of course, got to expertise that was above that of Shah Nawaz Khan. Of course, yeah, you have to write things like that about your patron. But even if not that, we see that there is an attempt to create a counter image, at least that. So I think that we have to rope all of this together, the works of Zuhuri, the inscriptions on Ibrahim Rosa, and actually the whole idea started with a visit to his tomb with David Schulman and Yigal Bronner, who basically, yeah, David just told me that I have to do it because someone needs to. So thank you, David, for that. His tomb is, of course, one of the most wonderful places in the Deccan. So yeah, I think that this will be the next thing. I really think that this will be the next thing to go. I have a few more ideas like Shivaji's coronation now and the North versus South Deccan. Yeah, there is no lack of things to do in the Deccan.
We have two, oh, sorry, Richard Eaton, did you want to?
All right. Well, I just wanted to follow up on a very quick question. You know, this goes back to your discussion of the foreigners and their mobility. And it occurred to me, do we know whether the foreigners were circulating in the southern Deccan as well as the northern Deccan? Is it your sense that they only moved, in other words, between the sultanates north of the Krishna? Or is it the case that they also were recruited by the kings of Vijayanagara as the Deccanese were? I mean, this might take us forward a bit in clarifying exactly, you know, what the Deccan is. Maybe we can think of at least the northern Deccan as the area in which only Persianate nobles were circulating. I just don't know. And I was wondering whether in your research you found instances of large numbers of Persian, you know, speaking foreigners circulating south of the Krishna.
Yeah. Okay. It's a very difficult question. I know, other than of course the famous tombs in next to Hampi of the Muslim commanders from the north, I didn't encounter cases in which I can say explicitly that those are foreigners who moved to Vijayanagara side. We know that there were a few Muslims who moved to the other side.
Right.
There is this wonderful, I keep on quoting this incredible case of the rebellion against or rebel Muslim leaders who decided they didn't get the Jagir that was promised to them around the border, around the Krishna. So immediately north of the Krishna. So they decided to cross the river and join Vijayanagara, and then attacked Golconda with Muslim commanders, against whom I think it was Ibrahim Qutb Shah at that period, so mid 16th century, sent his army under a Brahmin. And the wonderful narrative says that the armies of infidelity under the command of Rahem Dad were defeated by the Muslim forces under Rai Rao Brahman. And this is exactly shows this kind of complexity, even in the rhetoric itself, that the Persian tried to keep this Persian rhetoric and it ended up completely, yeah. But even in that case, I'm not sure that he was Iranian. I'm sure that if we dig deep enough, we will find individual cases, because adventurers are adventurers, and if there is an employment, there is employment. But large numbers, I didn't see any reference that I can say, but it's definitely something that it might be worth checking this from references from Vijayanagara, much more than those from the Northern Deccan, because they are so confined by the rhetoric. Yeah.
So, Roy, we've got several questions. So, three here. So I'll read out the first one, and this is from Sarah Wahid. In reference to the issue of considering linguistic geographies, what kind of primary source material in Dakhani in particular have you explored, if any? And can you speak more about the relationship between the emergence of vernacular or Dakhani in relation to Persian? For instance, there is Zuhuri's Persian poetry about the Deccan, but are there text materials in Dakhani you can speak about as well?
That's a difficult one. I'm no expert in Dakhani. That's a major thing. I'm really I relied more heavily on Persian and Marathi sources for this work. I did look at a little bit of the Kitab al-Nawras and more so at the Alinama. But unfortunately, I won't be able to answer to that in any reliable way. I'm afraid.
Yes, I think there is a response from some participants that Subha Dayal, in fact, is working along these lines. Yeah. And I think she has done Persian and also Dakhani with Ziauddin Shakib Saab. So she would be, in fact, in a position to, and she was also close to Sanjay Subramaniam, the Dakhani person, South Indian person, who knew so many Dakhani languages, South Indian languages. I think, yes, transformation from Persian to Dakhani, that's a good question. That has been, in fact, discussed with some of the Urdu language and literature historians, but they are not so, in fact, persuasive and convincing. Yeah. Okay, so I think I would not interfere beyond that.
Well, thank you. It's very helpful.
And here's a question from Zoltan Biederman, who says, thanks for a brilliant introduction and comments. What does not being imperial mean exactly when it comes to Deccan territorial organization? Are we looking at emerging sovereign territorial states where royal authority is not shared and layered and complicated in the way it is in Kerala and Sri Lanka?
Ooh, another very first of all, thank you, Zoltan, that you joined. I think that my primary concern here was political rhetoric here, and this idea of language of imposition. We don't know that much, unfortunately, and about the actual organization of the Deccan Sultanates. We know for some degree that there was a lot of integration of local elites within their own territories under some sort of organization or communication with the center. We see it in the case of Golconda. We have a few examples from the campaign of Ibrahim Qutb Shah to the, and afterwards Muhammad Quli Qutb Shah to northern Andhra, all the way up to the northern to Srikakulam, around Vizag and beyond to the Orissa border, that we see that there is a confirmation of local authority with sending the usual hostages to the center, to Golconda, and crashing whole families that were ruling there for 500 years if they did not cooperate. We see the introduction of governors from the center into other parts of the conquered territories. And we see that those, again, the idea of capturing this kind of structure was done in a way that, how to put it, if the Mughals used a lot of carrots and sticks, so cooperate with us, you will get rewarded, you won't cooperate with us, we will conquer Chitor, or we will Chitor you, I think that it's a good way to describe it. We don't see that much of it in the Deccan. We don't have these kind of stories, not because everyone was lovey-dovey with the rulers, but let's say, I don't think that we have signs of this kind of relationship of imposing permanent authority from the center. So we do have this layered, I guess that layered sovereignty is a good way to see it, and also very dynamic. So changing association between the center and the rulers. Once again, unfortunately, we do not have the wealth of. One of the biggest problems of the Deccan, let's say the heart or the core region of the Deccan Sultanate, or to use Pauli's term from before, Persianate Deccan, I think that it's a good distinction here, is that we don't have many administrative papers left. We do have some, but definitely not to the extent of the Mughal system. We do not have the Karnams that we have from the coastal region or the south, because the region was not ruled by the Madras presidency. So we don't have this kind of collection of local histories in the early 19th century. So it was beyond the jurisdiction of Mackenzie. So it's a lot of guesswork here, I guess. Sorry, I cannot give more systematic reply here.
So I'm just going to turn now to another question from William Crawley. So you speak in different contexts of established elites, many of them doubtless foreign themselves, accepting foreigners into their networks. What sort of criteria did they use for acceptance or rejection? Ethnic, religious, sectarian, family, geographical origins, or individual personality? Do you think there's also an echo in 19th and 20th century Hyderabad with the distinction between Mulkis and non-Mulkis?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Let me start from the end, the last bit. It's a very difficult connection or direction. I don't like to make these direct connections between, let's say, the Qutb Shahis and 19th, 20th centuries Nizam, because of the Mughal phase in between. And the Mughals kind of, or at least tried to impose different norms on the land, and then with the rebellion of the Asaf Jah I and the establishment of the Nizam in 1724, we don't see an explicit absorption of the Qutb Shahi past. I think, and to the question of what next, another future project would be to see how much of the Qutb Shahi past is actually surfacing or resurfacing in the Nizam, in the Nizam state in the early stages. The rhetoric, the political language is definitely referring much more to the Indian, to the North Indian, to the Mughal side of things than it is to anything local. And in that sense, I find it a bit problematic, or at least not instinctive. We cannot make an instinctive connection between the Mulki and rare Mulki of the 20th century to notions of the 17th century, although it might be the case, just that we have to establish this kind of connection more firmly in order to use it. The criteria, the problem is that the sources basically report only on those who succeeded. We don't know about those who tried to get employment and were rejected. They won't end up in the writing of the period. So we do know that those who were accepted, those who are described as accepted, all had positions, all had the jobs. There is a wonderful story, actually, by the anonymous chronicler of Golconda from the 16th teens. We don't know his name. Well, he never mentioned his name, but it is a major chronicle of Golconda's history up to the 16th teens, in which he tells a story about complaint of the people of Hyderabad to Muhammad Quli, that they are the migrants from the north who drink alcohol and act in debauchery, and they are public nuisance. So there was an order issued by the king that all the migrants from, and I quote, if I remember correctly, the provinces of Lahore and Agra, so it's clearly reference to North India, or to the Mughal Empire, who arrived in the Deccan and who do not have employment of any kinds, and I guess that the idea is royal employment, has to be deported, have to leave the country and go back to the north. So I think that my instinct would be that the main, let's say the main framework or the main criterion for their integration would be employment. If they are successfully employed, they will stay or have commercial interests that can bribe their way to stay.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question from Mrinalini Venkateshwaran, talking about the sources for the Deccan. Have you considered investigating Rajasthan, since the courts there were also involved in the Deccan on behalf of the Mughals?
That's a wonderful point, absolutely wonderful point. It's on my list of things for the next project. I agree that the Rajasthani sources can be incredibly helpful here, in particular of course, for the 17th century. As a matter of fact, I think that the 17th century needs more attention now, and the 17th century in the Deccan, I mean, from 1636, from the Mughal campaign that annihilated Ahmednagar and kind of started imposing increasingly draconian terms on Bijapur and Golconda.
And we've got another question from Minyu Chang. Many thanks for the introduction and comments. What can we learn from your study of a variety of identities in the early modern period in a non-imperial context, after much discussion on how identities were constructed in the colonial and nationalist narratives? So how's its relevance to today's political situation in India or other parts of the world? So yes, what does this sort of pre-modern take on identity do for us?
Whoa, that's I don't know even how to start this really important question. I don't know, I might dodge this one. I'm afraid of this question. It's really good, and at least 3 books can come out of this, I think. The one thing that I would like to, actually, that a comment that I do want to make, and seeing what's the kind of discourse in history departments today, and especially in the UK and North America, about questions of decolonization. And I think that I want to link it to that, and the idea that too much of the post-colonial discourse and the decolonization project is still relying on the colonial period as the one period that defined everything we know today in South Asia. So religious distinction, identities, structures, putting people into boxes is a colonial thing. And I think that my work kind of convinced me that, of course, there is truth to that, in the sense that the census really forced people to choose. And identities were heightened in the period, but the colonial knowledge did not come ex nihilo, ignoring the past of South Asia. We have these games of identities. We have these continuous attempts to deal with identity or define identity, and we see how identity as a construct, but we know that it's always a construct. Since Benedict Anderson, everything that we think about in terms of groups is a construct and imagine. It's not, my take is that it's not a new thing. It's not that to say that we see, again, direct linear connections between the 16th century and the 20th century. I will be very careful to make these kind of assumptions. But the idea that we have identities and the identities are negotiated and they matter in social and political context, I say that it's not a new thing at all, and we see it so vividly in the 16th century. I hope that this kind of starts a discussion in this super important question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I can't see more questions coming through. I think everyone's sort of saturated with so many ideas that have been going around. So I think what I'll do is, on behalf of everyone, say, oh, hang on. There is actually one more comment. So perhaps before I thank people, I'll just read out one more comment. Sorry. So this comes from Derek Land, responding to your response on William Crawley's question. So you mentioned that we only see the cases of foreigners who successfully settled. There are some accounts from foreigners who didn't, sorry, I'm reading to my screen. There are some accounts from foreigners who didn't have success or didn't find work, right? So Mufid Bafki, for example. It seems maybe a question of not having the right connections at any particular court upon arrival. Criteria for employment has most to do with solid networks, family, city of origin, etc. Don't you think?
That's a very, very good point. And I know, Derek, I know your excellent article that exactly discusses those cases. Yeah, no, I think that the reply to that should be in sources that were written in Iran. I didn't think about it. Yeah, no, it's a good point. Those who were written in Bijapur or in Golconda will ignore those that were not staying in, but you're right, those who write about their life after migrating back to Iran. Yeah. Point taken. Thank you for this comment. It's a really good one.
So I'll just read out a comment rather than a question from Cynthia Talbot, who said that she was that she didn't have a question. She was too busy digesting all these fascinating new perspectives, but she wanted to thank all the participants and the organizers for such an exciting and enjoyable session. And it's great to have an actual dialogue too, which is so rare nowadays in our Zoom world. So she says, thank you. And
let me thank Cynthia for this comment. It means a lot when it comes from you. So thank you so much for saying it. And I agree, the Zoom world has its advantages.
Yeah, from all over the world, in fact.
Yeah.
So on that note, I'll just add my thanks to Cynthia's. And so on behalf of everyone who's on mute, thank you, Roy. And thank you for this book. Congratulations on getting this out. It's so exciting to have this read, this source of reference and source of questions and arguments for us to work with moving forward. And thank you to our two respondents, Professor Eaton, Professor O'Hanlon, for responding to Roy and opening up the conversation so beautifully. So thank you very much, Roy.
And let me also thank you, Richard, and Polly, and also for Muzaffar for your comments and contribution at the end. And thank you for agreeing to take part in it. And it was really wonderful for me. Actually, we never showed the book. So this is how...
Yes, this is what I was thinking.
Yeah.
In fact, I had the book, yes. Oh, yes,
cover,
great.
Yeah, the cover,
Yeah,
which is taken from a mid-18th century painting.
Chand Bibi on horse, in fact, is not so visible, but it's still, it's, initially I thought, what is this cover? But then when I read the, description, I realized that this is very relevant.
Actually, it's a deliberate, first of all, I'm very happy with the graphic designer at Edinburgh for this fantastic work. I mean, I think it's a really beautiful cover. My idea was to find a landscape of the Deccan, somewhere where we can actually see this space. Now,
So this...
As much as everybody who knows me knows that I'm a very big fan of Chand Bibi, I think that she would take the attention to the wrong direction here. What I wanted here is the landscape. And besides, it's nice to have a green book.
Yeah.
It's quite unusual.
Okay. So,
Well,
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muzaffar.
And we'll be in touch. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to Alison and the Royal Asiatic Society for bringing us all together like this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alison and Matty, for organizing everything.
Okay.
Well, wherever you are, please raise a glass or a cup of tea to Roy and his book.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for all attending, and it was really great. Thank you very much indeed. We're very privileged to have hosted your wonderful book launch, and of course it is an RAS publication, so we're really pleased. Thank you very much, everyone.
And let's hope we'll be able to do something at the society at one point.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Richard.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's all great fun.
Right. Thank you.